So let's talk to Jamie Jenkins, who is, of course, our favourite statistician, former head of health analysis at the Office for National Statistics. Jamie, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. You all good?
Yeah, very well. Well, I mean, I say I am, but I'm pretty cheesed off if I'm being honest, because the data, not the dates business, has started to really wind me up. Because I know that you're a man that crunches numbers in a way which is very interesting, but nobody in the government seems to be doing it right at the moment, do they?
Well, I think we've talked in the past, Mike. All the goalposts keep moving, and
Yeah.
now obviously we're in the Euros at the moment. And that great goal from the Czech Republic, I think if Boris Johnson was in charge, it would never have been scored because they would have moved the goals to the corner flag probably. So
Yeah, well, maybe
I
Scotland should
think,
try that in the game against England. Otherwise, I think they're going to get slaughtered.
well, possibly, yeah. But Mike, you've been talking again on the show today about kind of the changing of the goalposts, etc. And that's exactly what's going on at the moment. We have seen over the last 6 weeks the rise of the Delta variant, the Indian variant that people are talking about in the Northwest. But about a month ago, I think they were saying we're going to go in, do a load of surge testing, start vaccinating people.
Mm.
I looked at the stats. There's been no increase in vaccinations in the Northwest the last month. So they haven't really been planning to try and ensure that June the 21st happens in England because they haven't done anything to increase the number of vaccines in the Northwest where this Delta variant's been rising. So there's a lot of rhetoric coming out about what they think they're going to do. It's just let's kick the can down the road for another month. And we've had some new stats out today, Mike, from the ONS on the job side of things. So some positive news for once. We've seen over the last month a 200,000 increase in the number of people in jobs, which is good. But let's not forget, there's still 500,000 people who are unemployed, who were employed before the pandemic. So people saying that we're not in lockdown, things are kind of coming back out. Well, there's still 500,000 people out there who wouldn't agree with that, would they?
Well, there's an awful lot of people that wouldn't agree with it because there's no way that you can describe what we are in as not a lockdown, given that so many things are not possible to do. I mean, I suppose if you were to say it's more akin to one of the tiers rather than an actual full lockdown, I would get that. But I think we would certainly be in something like a tier. Would it be a 3, where you've got limited numbers inside various establishments? We've got limited numbers in various groups. It's not. I don't think it's tier 2, is it?
Well, it may be like a tier 2, but remember, Mike, tier 1, and like in Wales, we've had different tiers, in Scotland, they've all had these different tiers. Tier 1 is unless go back to normal. Even tier 1 restrictions back in the day when we had all these different tiers had restrictions. I think Boris Johnson has been the only leader across the UK who's talked about getting rid of all of the restrictions in Wales, Scotland, and all that. That hasn't even been discussed with regards to that. I know Mark Drakeford's talked about, children staying with masks in class until the autumn, etc. So kicking the can down the road, and the critical thing, Mike. So the headline vaccine numbers that we've got is that because that seems to be the new narrative now is about how many vaccines are issued in terms of when we can ease restrictions. So the headline numbers say that about 41.7 million or 79% of adults across the UK have had the first dose, 30 million or 57 had the second dose. But what those headlines don't tell you, Mike, is the critical numbers of these. So if we look at 83% of all the deaths over the country have been over the age of the age of 70,
Right.
and then a lot of the younger people who make up the rest of the deaths are what you would class as in the clinically extremely vulnerable group. Now, over 90% of both those groups of people have had 2 doses of the vaccine, so you would say they're fully vaccinated. All the evidence suggests that the vaccine 2 doses is far better than any flu vaccine that we have. So all of the most vulnerable are vaccinated. Now, what Boris Johnson said yesterday, Mike, was that, but some of the younger people are catching it and they might spread it to people who are older. And we know that the vaccine's never going to be 100% perfect. But again, the goalposts have changed and we keep changing the goalposts. There's a lot of mental health issues. We've talked before, Mike, 10 million people, doubling in the number of people with mental health issues. And you quoted the numbers in the last half an hour about how many deaths per day.
Yeah.
Well, we've got more deaths per day probably going on in the country at the moment, tragically from suicide than we have from COVID. But let's continue with restrictions. It just doesn't seem much sense to what's going on at the moment.
And it really doesn't. And I was listening to Julia Hartley-Brewer this morning. She had a professor on. I can't remember exactly where he was from, but he wasn't an epidemiologist, but he was talking about the modelling that Sage had been doing. And he said that even under their latest modelling units, if you like, they were predicting 7,000 people in hospital with the new variant, and it's only 1,000. So they've got it wrong by a factor of 7. 7 times less the number than they said it would be. And even under the 7,000 number, they still thought that June 21st could be the day that everything was unlocked. So I'm not really sure which data they're now using.
Well, I think Chris Whitty talked yesterday of the rise in admissions in the Northwest, but let's put those numbers into
Yeah, but it's a
context.
percentage, isn't it?
They've gone from a really low number to slightly higher than a low number. There's about 300 people overall in hospitals in the Northwest
Yes.
who have tested positive for COVID. Now, what I've heard is the government may start releasing stats on how many are in hospital because of COVID rather than hospital having tested positive for COVID. Because remember, when the virus increases in society, more people are going to have COVID in a lot of different settings, including hospitals. So they test, I think, practically everybody that goes into hospital. So we need to know how many are going in because of COVID rather than have tested positive for COVID. But that 300 number, Mike, you were talking way over 4,000 back in January. So it's still relatively low. The Northwest has clearly been the hotbed for this rise of the Indian variant, the Delta variant. But some good news that we've seen in the recent days is maybe that rise is starting to taper off a bit. It's still early to say that, but the metric now is not about cases. I think when we last spoke, Mike, I said when you ease restrictions, you'd expect some cases to go up. They're going up predominantly in the age groups of 10 to 19 and 20 to 29. Not surprising. These are the people who probably want to go out and see their mates, see their friends, etc. Less likely to get ill. And I think I wrote a blog yesterday, Mike, that we've reached that point now where we're never going to get to zero COVID. Even the Prime Minister's talking about living with COVID. And we've now got to start having a real debate about what's an acceptable level of risk to live with COVID. Because even in the latest week, Mike, we're getting 4 times as many deaths. ONS published the latest data again this morning. 4 times as many people dying every week from pneumonia and flu, which are respiratory viruses, etc. So all the social distancing and everything isn't stopping those deaths. 4 times as many die from that than from COVID.
Yeah.
We're going to have to accept, sadly, that people will die with COVID. And you can't basically throw all of your eggs into stopping one thing and not looking at the economic harm, the wider mental health harm. And people are saying the NHS is...
You know, the government talks about using caution and safety first and all of that. Well, it's not safety first if loads more people are either suffering mentally and or physically because of the government restrictions, because an awful lot of this is imposed by government. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the big stretch on the NHS at the moment is the fact that we're catching up with what's gone on over the last kind of year. We've got waiting lists at record levels across the whole of the UK. We've got lots of misdiagnosis. You know, there's going to tragically be deaths because people haven't gone to see the doctors, haven't gone to see, seek medical help, etc. You know, you've had some tragic callers on the show about, people being diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. You know, every lives really should be mattering with all of this. And with COVID at such low levels at the moment, this is the prime opportunity to unlock. I think people are saying, and some people, they may be joking about it sometimes on social media about, well, by middle of July now there'll be another variant, but that's a real possibility. There's always going to be new variants. You can't keep chasing new variants and trying to chase them all out. They're going to happen. We've just got to learn to live with the virus, Mike.
Yeah.
And
Well,
what is that
exactly.
acceptable level?
I mean, when you see Theresa May emerging as one of the kind of voices of common sense and one of the people who actually is one of the most cautious people probably in political history as Prime Minister, suddenly saying, look, we've got to get on with it. You know that she's thought about it. You know that she's given it a great deal of consideration. And she has come to that conclusion. And quite frankly, I think Boris needs to do the same thing. But have you also noticed, Jamie, that last week there was the return of the dreaded R number, which we never heard about whenever it was below 1, but now they think it's gone up to 1.4. Well, of course it has, because it goes up as a result of what happens in public policy. The more that opens up, the Euros are on, people are going to football matches, that's going to push it up, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that, Mike. And you could argue that if we know that people who are generally younger don't generally get very ill, some of the mixing, remember people talk about herd immunity back last March. It would have probably been a suicidal policy knowing that there was huge amounts of older people who were going to be at risk and would have died. So we've got the position now where I've said that over 90% of the most vulnerable groups have had the vaccine. You're never going to get 100% because sadly there'll be some people who can't have the vaccine, just like they can't have flu vaccine. So there will always be, sadly, some people who will have to shield. And there'll be some people in those age groups as well, or in those groups who just don't want the vaccine as well. So let's assume that we've offered all the jabs that people are going to take in the most vulnerable. Now, if people are catching it at younger age groups, then obviously that will start leading to some more immunity. They are going to get the vaccines rolled down as well. Now people start talking about long COVID, and of course that's going to put some impact on people. But remember, people still have a choice with these restrictions. If we've seen, and you had Laura talking about her book, The Fear That's been put into kind of the public. There are still a lot of fear out there. People still have a choice. The government can reduce restrictions. It doesn't mean that people who still want to treat themselves with caution have to go out to the bars, the restaurants, etc. They can still have some caution. So I think that's the one thing that people seem to be forgetting, is that a lot of people who want to get on with their lives, and a lot of people who may not want to get on with their lives, but that's a personal choice. And at the moment, you're not getting that personal choice because they keep kicking the can down the road when all the data metrics would suggest otherwise. And you should, if you're not going to get on with it now, Mike, we're going to get to, say, July. And if that's kicked down the road, you're going to then start to get towards September. We know the cases will probably start rising again in September. And then you start getting into next year. We've kind of starting to get lockdowns or restrictions becoming the normality when they should have been a temporary measure to curb the virus.
Exactly right. Because at the end of the day, if they're using as a measure how many people have been vaccinated, and I said this to Dan Hodges, if the same people who are currently not vaccinated because they don't want to be remain unvaccinated because they haven't changed their minds, then that number isn't going to move, is it?
No, and that was the thing they've been citing in the Northwest about the Indian variant, was it's spreading more on people who are not vaccinated. Right. So ultimately, if people don't want to get vaccinated, you're going to have to accept, again, in society, there will be people who will go to hospital. That's their choice if they don't want to vaccinate.
Well, that's what hospitals are for, isn't it?
Well, we know, Mike, that the actual coronavirus vaccine itself is far more effective than the flu vaccine. So a few years ago, when we saw a huge influx of flu deaths, the flu vaccine was only about 29% effective. One of the concerns we might have this winter, actually, is because there was very little flu last year, and there's very little flu around the world at the moment that we're detecting, is what should be in the flu vaccine for this winter. That might be more of a pressure. But ultimately, when we have that, we don't talk about vaccinating the whole population for the flu. We vaccinate the vulnerable and get on with it.
Well, there'll be loads of people who don't get the flu vaccine who have now got the COVID vaccine because they thought they should. But, take up on the flu vaccine isn't very big. And so loads of people don't get it. But they don't get castigated by everyone because they're being irresponsible. What if you end up in hospital? Well, what if you end up in hospital? If you keep talking to me like that might be where you end up.
Well, Mike, I can guarantee if we were doing the same kind of testing, and there's a lot of criticism, the lateral flow test that you've been discussing in the last half an hour, the US and nothing. Do you know, at the moment, Mike, it's quite a remarkable stat. 850,000 tests a day are being carried out across the UK. Most of that is in England, and the majority of that are these lateral flow tests that people are kind of criticising. So you've got this huge amount of testing. If we had exactly the same tests and we're doing them every winter for the flu, we literally would have been locking down every single winter for the last, certain number of years. But we don't do that, Mike. We accept a certain level of risk. People who are vulnerable get vaccinated, and we live with that. And ultimately, that's what we've got to do with COVID. And it just doesn't seem to be a debate going on at the moment. Boris talks about living with it. Well, he needs to start looking in terms of, right, we're going to live with it. What is an acceptable level of risk to live with it? And the problem you've got is that some people on stage obviously have all these kind of pro lockdowns, pro restrictions all the time. And I'm just wondering how much of this, Mike, is that some of these scientists, they're loving the power that they've kind of got over the government. And
I think they are. No question.
You've got to move on.
You can imagine the Brothers Grimm, the movie. Jamie, listen, I've got to run because we're running late, but good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Jamie Jenkins, former head of health analysis at the Office for National Statistics, with some proper data and some proper data, not dates information, which is what we need right now. What we need is common sense. More of it coming up next on Talk Radio.